And so I think we can turn it over to the chat and open up the discussion. So I'll start from the top of the chat. So first question, would the import function include legal and regulatory requirements documents, especially across countries and industries? An application might be able to identify where similar requirements could be collated to generate commonalities and link what could otherwise be considered unique. Good question. Do you want to add anything to that before we open it up to the group for discussion?
No, that's a great presentation, by the way. Where I'm going there, you kind of alluded to part of it, which was the translation across languages specifically. A lot of times there's legal and regulatory requirements within and across nations that are different, particularly things like security, personal security information, and all that type of stuff. When we look at the import function, one of the opportunities that might exist is looking across the range of those types of things, that translation function you alluded to, and then further, how do those things potentially have linkages that might be otherwise obscure? So in other words, if I'm looking at one document, then another document, then another document, I may miss some of the potential linkages and say, well, I can engineer this as a requirement to do such that meets these 5 different requirements instead of meeting them individually. I don't know if that's something that you've been looking at.
I think it's a great point, and it is kind of related to that, maybe document analysis or import. So the ability to go through a document or a set of documents and maybe help identify trends. It kind of looks like a mix of the first and second bullet point, maybe to help say, hey, I've got all these standards and I'm importing them, but I've noticed commonalities. Maybe when you derive your own requirements for this, you could find some common ones you could create. Really good point. I don't know if the functionality is out there. I'd be interested to hear what other users have to say.
Thank you.
I've played with AI quite a bit, both at home and at work, and I think the answer is it depends. I think you can definitely achieve a lot of aspects of what's just been discussed, but I think a lot of it goes down to just how good is the tool. And I think some of the points that you've mentioned, it seems very, very capable. And so with the approach of trust and verify, it's very, very easy to just sort of go like, hey, it looks like it's working. Let's just start trusting it more so than verifying. One thing that we've noticed is that as the function that the tool performs, which may be very, very quick, such as importing documents into your requirements management tool, the case in point, it may be very, very fast, but then, let's say you're importing, I don't know, let's say 100 standards into your tools. If you don't know how much you should trust it, then the verification onus potentially becomes much, much larger, because now someone potentially being a human needs to go back through the existing standards, needs to go through the input and do a mapping to say, yeah, that actually worked. Whereas if someone, was maybe a human was assisted by the AI and doing it, they would be sort of cross-checking as they go. So I think it's really, really important. One thing we've identified is really important to identify what the actual full task is and not focus in just on the little tiny aspect of a use case that's part of a complete task that needs to be done. Because where AI saves you a lot of time, you might pay back in human workload on the verification side. In this trust and verified aspect, we do a lot of, hey, it's really cool I did that, but people don't tend to think as much about the verified side of the equation.
That's a really good point, and I completely agree with you. I think analyzing these use cases holistically with what are we actually trying to achieve and what are the steps of that process, make sure this makes sense to use it there, that we're not making one activity simpler, but then something else in the process just became a lot more complicated or impossible. Great point.
One conversation I was having earlier with a colleague is kind of related to this from a standard standpoint. So in aerospace, we use a lot of ARP, SAE, and even the NCOSI standards for a cab member. But it was if we use these documents, these standards as part of our reference or our database, a lot of the ways that we purchase these are through individual licenses, not a corporate license, if you will. So now am I violating anything because the source of the data is shared to other colleagues that may not have these licenses? Kind of a legal question that came up, not really looking for an answer, just commenting that that's something to consider.
This is Lou. I think that's a key consideration for all the data that is being used to train, even like using the COSI Guide to Writing Requirements and using that as a source of rules. there's IP associated with the use of that. The big question is right now there's a debate, well, we should share everything and ignore IP so that humanity as a whole has access to that information. Other people say, no, IP costs money to develop, so we should honor the IP and get the permissions. And especially a lot of standards organizations are really businesses whose funding is based on buying rights to the use of the standards. We can't ignore that part. Another point on standards is that they're written generically for a class of products, not specifically for a given product. So in previous stuff we put out about the use of standards, is organizations really have to go look at that family of standards, determine which one apply to their particular domain, and then develop their internal company standard that interprets which standards they're going to build to and form a library in the requirement management tool from that perspective. I don't know that AI can really do that. Company has to kind of make that determination themselves. That goes in with both process the company's going to use, as well as some of the limitations that Sarah talked about.
Yeah, thank you, Lou. That's a good point too. I'm going to move to this second point here from Darius. So I wonder how much emotional baggage comes with the concept of AI. What if we talked about some new tool we could develop to address the following use cases instead? Do you have any more information you'd like to add about this one? I'm not
Yeah,
sure I
sure.
fully understand. Okay, great.
Listening to you talk about some of the language, I guess, that was mentioned, and that's not to pick on you, Sarah, because I thought it was a great presentation. But we're talking about things like, hey, we're doing this to save time and effort. The AI may not be able to catch anything, or may not be able to catch everything. How realistic is AI to be able to do its own work? Then we were talking about, sort of people's fear about the tool taking over their job, saying things like, well, it's not going to replace our jobs and things like that. In a way, I'm looking at this as, are we sort of trying to think about, if we think about the RE process, requirements engineering process, in terms of, say, the Incozy Book of Knowledge, where's the pain points? Well, what do people care about? Where's the biggest pain points? And are we trying to sort of find a tool that would help with those pain points most? And hey, there's something out there that's called AI, and that could help. Are we trying to sort of map what the current AI capabilities are onto that and figure out how much it can help? It's not exactly clear as to exactly what we're trying to achieve. But having said that, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm building this, I do the lowest hanging fruit first, get as much sort of movement as I can with the low hanging fruit. But then I think the things of interest are actually the ones that I sort of term them as high cognitive load. And if AI can help me do that, like hell yeah, like let's get me out of this job. And I think that I've worked my entire life to get myself out of a job. I've failed so far, so I don't think that we should panic.
That's a really interesting perspective. I think you're right that the use cases we're looking at, it's because potentially these are pain points in the requirements engineering process. For me, something I identify as a pain point is because it requires a lot of manual effort, it's tedious or repetitive, it doesn't really add value, and it's not fulfilling work for the engineer. And unfortunately, there's a lot of things that fall into that category when it comes to managing requirements. I think mainly because of the sheer amount of data that we have to process. So, as a systems engineer working in requirements, I'd like to focus on the interesting parts, like understanding what the customer needs and finding a creative solution to it, rather than, let's say, parsing through 10,000 requirements to find some piece of information I'm looking for. Yeah, it's very interesting to see how we would want something, AI or some tool, to help with whatever pain points we've identified.
I guess there's an interesting point that you just said there as well is, yeah, I think that's probably a much better characterization. It's sort of get the machine to do the boring work and let us get onto the interesting aspects. I guess with the capabilities of AI, there could be a question that's raised that says, and maybe that's the implicit fear. What if the machine is better at the things that you're interested in Right. Rather than the other way around. But I think there's examples of that already in terms of, say, machines playing chess and getting so much better that humans probably just wouldn't be able to beat the machines. And yet the world of chess players, I've been told, has exploded just because it generated more interest, not because humans can beat the machines.
Yeah, and actually, I'd love to go back to our smart intern analogy for that. So every once in a while, a smart intern may think of something we didn't think of, even if potentially we are the expert in whatever concept it is for systems engineering. So I would see it as maybe a pleasant surprise if AI could figure out something we didn't know and help us then to go from there. Like take that as our next step, what to do with it. So if they can do things we can't figure out ourselves, I'm actually into that. I'm okay with it.
I was going to say real quick, this is a fascinating conversation. What it gets to is two things. It gets to the scope, scale, and the role of AI as a tool or as a smart intern. It's okay to listen to the intern until the intern is trying to tell the CEO what to do, and
Yes.
you have to be kind of careful with that on the one hand. On the other hand, it gets to a comment that was made somewhere in the chat here relating to what is the problem we're trying to address using AI. And in my mind, I guess to things like, the completeness, the comprehensive, the coherence of the requirements themselves as a grand set using all these large language models. And I agree with the points made earlier about the IP and proprietary issues. The large language models are not going to have access to certain elements of those, and they shouldn't, I don't think. On the other hand, the question becomes, where can cost benefit be realized in terms of prioritizing requirements and again linking requirements that might otherwise not be obvious to a human that's going through 10,000 pages in 100,000 hours of documents that a AI tool can do in 5 seconds. So there's a balance, as you indicated earlier, that has to be found there as well. Just some thoughts. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Darius. Sorry.
Great point.
The point I was, I guess, trying to make was very similar to yours, John. That is that, these AI machines are getting to a level where they can generate insight. And that's exactly what we want them for, right? I sort of call that the cognitive load, if you like, that we're trying to reduce, although insight probably doesn't fit into that category very well. But it's that aspect of, looking for the best insights. And if we only get them to do the menial tasks, if you like, sorting data, then are we missing out on some of the potential best capabilities if we're talking a capability evaluation of these tools?
You get to an interesting point. It's a double-edged sword in some way. I agree with the notion of wanting the tools to generate those insights. Later, we'll get to the comments about the cost of AI. One of the costs isn't monetary. It's that what's AI taken over that we no longer are forced to actually work through and think through. And there's a potential danger in that with expertise and elements of how the analyses are conducted may be reduced or may be limited. And then we won't know until too late, potentially, that we've lost something. I go back to the ancient times when the battleships were brought back in the 80s. They had to bring a bunch of old guys like me out of the retired ranks, have them operate the ships because they didn't have the documentation and they couldn't figure out how the old analog systems work. I'm not saying go back to analog. I'm saying we should not lose that knowledge. So it's a question of how can AI retain some of that knowledge as another function? How does it build I don't want to call it a database, but a knowledge base of some sort that says, yeah, we're in all this advanced digital stuff, but this old analog stuff did it this way. Is there something we can go pull out of the dusty shelves and say maybe it's relevant in a new way given the new technologies and capabilities that we've generated? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's something that occurs to me.
I think it makes perfect sense. Maybe just noting the point of the double-edged sword. If we're almost saying, hey, this could do the job of an intern, in essence, we're saying we potentially are replacing that intern. So that intern will not grow up to be a systems engineer and then a senior systems engineer and then retain that knowledge per exactly what you just discussed, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. You don't want the role of the intern to be lost, but that's a learning piece. That's something that through hard work and making mistakes has learned something that over time becomes a seasoned person, hopefully in 30, 40 years that doesn't make those same mistakes and is aware of those. But when we think about, what that role of the intern is, the intern doesn't just get coffee anymore. As interns have become more used, papers, they're doing some higher order function. So the role that intern function, your points are well made.
Okay, this is really great. I'm going to keep going through the comments though, just so we can try to get to all of them, but really great discussion. So a comment from Lou, the guide to writing requirements lists characteristics of well-formed needs and requirements and sets. These characteristics are a function of underlying analysis that is domain specific as well as generic rules to follow. So currently AI seems better suited to a subset of rules that don't require thought or analysis. Did it follow a rule or not? However, characteristics like correct, complete, consistent, feasible, appropriate to the level seem to not be suitable with current AI state of the art. Yes, and I think this comes back to that point about the limitation of AI having domain specific knowledge, because when we think about us writing a requirement, not only do we need to know how to write a well-formed requirement, like from the guide to writing requirements, we need to know the system or thing for which we're writing it. And so if AI can do one of those but not the other, it's not going to create as good of quality requirements as we would need. If there's a way to have AI support both of those somehow, and maybe as a starting point or as a user prompt, get a first draft out there, maybe that's the area where we're potentially able to achieve with AI. And then, of course, a user would end up taking ownership of that requirement, refining it, reviewing it, releasing it. And I keep going. So what about AI in terms of the standards that AI is trained on and other limitations? AI doesn't seem to be able to differentiate the age of the information or standards. And it doesn't seem to be aware of the trustworthiness of the information it is trained on. So these are all comments from Lou, and this is great. I think I'd like to spend a couple of minutes here discussing what standards is the AI itself trained on? Is there a standard? How do we make sure the AI is getting the right information if maybe it's pulling something old or something outdated? And how do we know that AI itself knows if the information should be trusted? Now we can open the discussion on those points.
Yeah, I brought that up because AI first came out. I played around with it naturally. I would ask, and probably my prompt were lacking. I'd ask it, are you aware of a guide to writing requirements? And it would say yes. And I say, could you list the characteristics of good requirements? And it would list some characteristics, but they weren't necessarily from the guide to writing requirements. They were just from a whole bunch of different things that it found that talked about characteristics. And then I'd say evaluate a set of requirements according to those characteristics, and it would identify some rule violations. And then I say, okay, rewrite those requirements without violating those rules. And it just gave me a bunch of more requirements that violated the rules. It didn't check its own work for quality.
I see. So it'll check your requirements, but it won't find any fault with its own generated ones.
I'm afraid it would get into an endless do loop if it tried.
I fully agree with your observations, but I'm not sure if I agree with the validity of the comment, maybe. When we talk about AI, you would have used some chatbot, for example. Like, there's various different AI tools out there. And again, I do use the word tool, and it's sort of like saying, hey, if AI wasn't out there, there's various tools out there that currently do some sort of, let's say, check on the requirements, looking for words, shell, must, all that sort of stuff. One tool does it, another tool doesn't. Yeah, we wouldn't be making generic sweeping statements around all requirement management tools are terrible at picking up shell statements. So it really, really comes down to, well, what's the tool designed to do? And I think even with the earlier limitations of the tools, there were ways in which to augment it or customize it to be better at performing the job that it needs to perform. But in a way, I'd harken back to what are the requirements on this tool, right? How well have those requirements been verified? And does the tool therefore take you only 50% of the way through the process that you're trying to achieve? Does it take you 95% of the way? And how have you set yourself up to fill the gaps that all tools inevitably leave?
Really great insight and good for us to think about. Going to keep going down through our list because I see more comments we haven't gotten to yet. Comment here about trustworthiness of the information and the tool itself must be a critical ongoing assessment, kind of like an automobile navigation system where people follow it into a river. Over reliance is an easy temptation. I 100% agree. I think we are far away from being able to use AI as is without that human oversight. Again, a little bit of skepticism is needed. If it can help us, that's great, but we still need to make sure it's helping us and not doing something that looks helpful but really isn't. Great point, John. Anyone have comments on that?
If your navigator, your mate was sitting next to you and was doing the same thing, would you end up in the river, right?
Good point.
Not if your eyes are open. You got to look ahead of the hood of the car, right?
Over trusting again, right? That's key, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key is a balance of how you enable users and how you build in the right type of friction into the product, or so that you can either teach people what the limitations are and what to look out for so that they know they're not going to walk into a trap and over rely on something that's going to make mistakes. You can also build the tool in a way that it says, here's what I think, but I'm not sure. Do you really want to accept this even though I think it might be right? Start putting those types of prompts into the tool, and it hopefully starts to make people think a little bit more before they just blindly accept things.
If there's an essential point here, it's the emphasis that AI is a tool. It's not a comprehensive, complete thing that does everything. So when we think about it like that, the danger is you have a hammer, everything's a nail. So we have to be careful not to use AI where AI is not relevant or applicable. But there's a tendency sometimes to look at a tool and think it does more than it should or could do, and then rely on it and in a way that leads to misfortune at the end of the day. Dan, I saw your other comment about the cost of AI. I think that's an important area. It's relevant here too.
So the comment regarding the cost, it's more than monetary, potential loss of analytical expertise, errors in judgment, resourcefulness of users, etc. So you had a good response here. If you'd like to walk us through it.
Sure. Yeah, I think in general, all of this comes down to implementing AI the right way. If you implement it in a way that essentially allows someone to think of it as you just go fix this for me, AI, or do all of the analysis for me, and I'm just going to take the results and move on, that's a problem. It's going to start meaning that people miss things, people quote unquote drive into the river, or people forget how to do it themselves. If you put the right guardrails in place, though, and you treat the tool as help me find things I missed and let me make sure I agree with you type of approaches, you actually build that expertise even more. I would think that you would find that people learn more effectively how to do things that they weren't as good at before because they have this tool helping them identify things they didn't know how to identify in the past. And they have to think about whether or not they agree before they actually accept it. And I think those guardrails can both help someone learn and maintain that knowledge. I think it also could be put in place to keep someone from driving into the lake where you may just click on a button and accept what it does. But if you can build the process or the system in such a way that maybe AI does the first analysis, for example, and a human has to do the final analysis, you can start to find ways to manage some of that load. And AI in that place is helping you create a better first draft rather than defining the final version for you.
Yeah, and actually, Dan, you had the comment in the meeting earlier today about the smart assistant, right?
About the smart intern, yeah.
Smart intern, sorry.
Yep.
What you just said made me think of that another way. In the context of AI helping you to learn, I could almost see it as a mentor too. Like in some ways, it can be an intern for you. In some ways, it can be a mentor to help teach you the right process or teach you the right way of thinking with analytical skills. I really like what you said about putting boundaries on the functionality so that it helps us think what might be missing or what we need to consider as important, as opposed to just blindly trust what I'm giving you from the AI.
Where I would draw concern with the concept of mentor is that sometimes you assume your mentor knows better than you and you need to learn from them. And I think with AI, it'll help you think it might even know better than you, but it may be really confidently wrong. And so you just need to be careful that you learn from it, but you don't learn the wrong things. And enabling people to understand how to work with AI more effectively is pretty important to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, but related to that, I think you're onto something that's also important. Again, going back to my double-edged sword, and here's where I'll say that AI has value potentially in creating a cyborg when it comes to a cognitive unit, being a human-machine combination. What the AI can really do is think fast. It doesn't mean it thinks well, it just thinks really, really fast. But it can also think much more broadly in some situations than a human probably could because of its access and reach to potentially obscure and diverse sets of information. So the mentor term I wouldn't use necessarily. I would use a cognitive assistant or checkpoint, where it's also checking your answers and saying, you say this, you see these insights is not relevant, but here's all the areas that support that. So it gets into kind of a probabilistic analysis of the probability of this is X, the probability of that is Y. Have you considered it from that framework instead of just saying, I'm going to go with a gut reaction? And there's real value potentially there, I think.
Wanted to add to that because I think this is a fascinating discussion as well. I see it more as we sort of say AI and mental. I think fully pay the concept of someone may think, oh, your mentor's smarter than you, and people talk about AI hallucinating and getting things totally wrong and being very confident about it. But so are we as people, right? We could be sitting here spewing absolute facts that we think are right, but then we go back and check and it's like, oh, actually, I was wrong on this one. But I think value really comes out of a lot of this is through discussion. So that ancient Greek concept of, dialogos, and the very mechanisms of potentially generating insights are that ability to discuss ideas and bounce them off each other. And this is that concept where I think the AI can play in situations where you're limited to access to others, can provide that sounding board, if nothing else, to generate the insights, generate ideas. But ultimately, that you're still the one responsible for taking them to wherever that they need to go. And if you maintain that approach, that's essentially the same approach of interacting with a human.
Yeah, really great discussion, you guys. So, comment from Monica, are there existing tools that handle some of the use cases you presented, like being able to import customer documents or standards into a tool? Maybe IBM ELM tools are providing some direct AI tools. It would be nice to see if some exist, that each company isn't developing their own tools to help approach these use cases versus each reinventing their own wheels. I'll open this up to discussion. There's definitely some tools out there. As far as what everybody's using, I think it's probably varied throughout the industries and organizations and everywhere.
This is Monica. You mentioned earlier that you would like to be able to get in to work this stuff, do the design and understand the requirements, but then get into the design and not worry about what the requirements are doing, the massive requirements. And that's kind of where I feel my role is. I'm basically doing requirements management / storage administration. When I try to advertise myself to be the one that supports all of you guys, as far as the one that handles the requirements, the metrics, the importing the documents, whatever, so you don't have to. You just get to have to go through the requirements, understand what's there, do your compliance matrix and stuff like that. Now, with respect to the AI, I recognize I need to learn a little bit more what AI can offer that can help me to be a little more efficient and at the same time not leave me across the river. It was mentioned in my job, as far as being able to look at some things for importing documents, but I really was so involved at that point in time working on documents and not having time to. I figured that was more of a spare time kind of thing. Anyway, so I kind of asked that in regards to what kind of tools are out there. Also, I had recently read an article on LinkedIn where someone had written about AI. He kind of approached it from the same thing that you were talking about as far as some of the use cases of importing metrics, validating the requirements and stuff like that. But I wanted to ask him the same question. Hey, are there some tools out there, or is each company developing kind of their own? That's kind of where my background came from as far as coming up with that question.
I may rephrase that slightly and open up the question. So in the morning discussion, we talked about where are people today? Because again, we're trying to keep it not confidential information or anything like that. But we did ask, are users more thinking that AI would be some kind of commercial solution, that it would be a in-house solution that companies are developing for themselves, or potentially would it be some kind of mix of both of those? So we asked that question in the earlier meeting and got some responses. So again, here, feel free, anyone who wants to share, just at that high level of detail.
This is John again. The bigger picture, though, an interesting thought experiment would be, what if AI had to generate requirements for AI? How would it go about doing that? Not being platform specific or tool specific. when I think about that, the other question, it's not a question, it seems to me, of what tools exist now. It's where might the tools exist in 3 to 5 years, which is almost unimaginable given the rate of progress in the AI community. I mean, you look at what ChatGPT's done in just a few years, it's remarkable. It's almost like we're getting to that cyborg comment I made earlier, where the natural order of things may be a team of human AI components versus just AI as a support structure. And that has, again, potential for great things, but also great danger. So I don't know if that is an area that the requirements working group here in NCOSI is looking at is, how do we understand the future and use our imaginations to kind of conceive it when AI, I think Darius mentioned something about the hallucinations it has. Sometimes those hallucinations become the new reality. We have to be careful. I'm curious anybody's reaction to that.
I like a little bit on the Google search. In the past, you always had to kind of figure out the right terms to ask to kind of get an idea of what you're looking for. Now you can almost just kind of ask the question and it recognizes more or less what you're looking for and gives you. And if you need a little bit more depth, then you can ask the question from a different point. But with this AI kind of aspect, it seems to understand a little bit more what you're trying to ask in the first place. Well, importing documents has always been kind of a little bit, as you say, tedious, rote. There's certain ways to do it, but maybe there's some things that are better. In Germany, the team I was working with had a particular tool that could import PDF documents straight into doors, but I hated the results. It always looked really clumsy. And so I kind of preferred doing the more rote way of doing it, being converting to Word document, kind of pre-prepping the Word document, importing it in, but then you still had to do some cleanup afterwards. And that was obviously time consuming. So if there are some clean ways to do that, or coming up with scripts for handling metrics, where you can just indicate this is what I want, and coming up with the metrics, but then still double checking to make sure that it's really coming up with what you really. That's some of the areas I would have some interest in. And then also looking at quality to some extent of the requirements themselves. I can't see it developing requirements, as like Lou pointed out, but if there's something that can check to see that it looks like it's basically following structure to help the engineers, but then the engineers are still responsible for cleaning things up before reviews.
Yeah, I think with AI, one of the things we have to keep in mind is always coming back to we're the requirements working group, right? So what are the stakeholder needs? We're the stakeholders, kind of. What are our needs? Why would we want to use AI? And I think that's been kind of a theme of today's meeting. What are the pain points or needs that we have that we think AI can help with? I think there was a comment, are we just looking for AI to solve some problem that we don't really understand what it is? Or are there legitimate needs we have and we think this could be a solution? So understanding those needs and then combining that with both the capabilities and the limitations of AI, I really think it's probably something that needs to be tailored by each group that's looking into this. I don't think we can make a one size fits all, but that combination of needs, capabilities, and limitations, I do think organizations can find a place where they can find value for them using AI for requirements engineering. And that might look different from one place to the next.
So coming up with the basic set of tools, but then they could be tailored by the companies that are using those tools. Might be an interesting standpoint.
With my company, we work with IBM ELM tools as well, and IBM offer up the Watson AI. We've played with them in terms of application of Watson to do requirements analysis per the check requirements quality, your third point there, against the NCOSI Good Writing Guide. They address some of the sort of semantics and sentence structure aspects, grammar, exactly as we commented before, but they didn't really address any of the consistency issues, things like, have you addressed all the use cases, have you addressed all the functions that we know the system potentially may need, has to have, and whatnot. So it was still a long way off, but I think vendors will definitely be all over this because it's buzzwords. But I think, companies probably also feel that they need to develop their own to try and keep abreast the technology. So if you're talking, to guys like NVIDIA, they talk about, using AI to devise their own chips and devise their own AI capable chips. So turning the technology on itself is very much the exponential growth path that one can say. I think also, Monica, one thing that you've given me as part of this chat is that very good question that I think a really important reminder of the capability of these tools seems to be really, really awesome. And it may sort of be pushing us out of some jobs. But then the question is sort of, it almost rolls it up to the aspect of human value. And it's probably way more than just how our jobs define us, but it really pushes us into that philosophical world of where the value add. And I'd want to say it's probably a hell of a lot more than just the jobs that we currently do, right? Because there will be a better tool tomorrow that can probably do everything I'm doing right now as well.
I think you were one of the other ones mentioned about working yourself out of a job. Maybe it's kind of perspective of working out of one particular type of task, but then you still have multiple other tasks. Over time, you work your way out of other tasks, but then that gives you maybe some freedom to work on things that you really more enjoy, right?
There's always chaos that needs ordering, I think. So,
Yeah.
so I don't think we're going to run out of that very quickly.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you, Sarah. This was a great talk. Great slides.
One thing I just put in the chat, Dan was talking about the cost of AI in terms of people becoming over reliant on AI and losing some ability to do the analysis themselves. And there's an old science fiction short story called The Sack, written back in 1950, that addresses that exact problem, where the Sack is actually an alien AI that can answer any question. And some of the pitfalls in having that ability are discussed in that story. So you can find it online. It's a really interesting story.
Thanks, Lou.
Who's it by?
William Morrison. But I think it is a good time to end on. Certainly thank y'all for y'all's time. I'd like to thank Sarah for her time. It's an excellent presentation as always.